So be aware that this webinar is being recorded. Great. So again, my name is Craig Fisnick. Greetings from southern Wisconsin, where there's a layer of ice on the ground and my kids are home from school today because of that. And it's kind of novel and nice that they're only home for a day because of the weather. So Sand County Foundation, as many of you know, we're a nonprofit organization. We're based in Wisconsin, though we have a national reach. Let me advance my slide, please. We support managers and owners of private working lands, namely farmers and ranchers, to apply a land ethic in their land management. Some of you may be familiar with the Leopold Conservation Award. We award that annually in over 20 states now across the country. We also do demonstrations and projects with innovative farming practices. And one of those is Prairie Strips. We've been intrigued by the work from Iowa State that has occurred over the last 10 to 15 years, researching the effect of converting a fraction of row crop area into permanent perennial native cover and its benefits for water quality and for wildlife. We've talked about that the last two webinars, and today we're going to focus more on the benefits for native insects, beneficial insects, pollinators, honeybees, and the likes with our guest. I will note that Iowa State is supporting us through a grant from the Bia Echo Foundation to enable us to do this webinar today. And we've shared the poll, is that right, Lena, with our attendees? We can do that. Great. All right, so let me introduce you to our guest. We have one guest today, so he's going to get a good 40 minutes to give a lot of good information, and then we'll take some Q&A. Dr. Matt O'Neill, he's a professor of entomology at Iowa State University, where he oversees research related to the management of insect pests and annual crops, especially a focus on soybean aphids. He's also doing research that explores the abundance and diversity of beneficial insects, their role in pest management, as well as in crop pollination. And with that, I will pass the screen to Matt.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Okay, I'm going to pick up with my slides, if that's all right. Hopefully you can see these. Yeah? Okay, so great. Thanks for the introduction, Craig, and thanks for the invitation to talk to your colleagues, friends, farmers, et cetera, that are on the line today. So today I'm going to talk about, maybe some 10 years worth of research that we've done exploring the benefits of prairie strips for beneficial insects. And what do I mean by beneficial insects? Well, pollinators, specifically honeybees, are one of those. And then what the title calls natural predators. And let me explain that a little bit here. There are many types of insects, and we can define them based on how they look, but also how they feed. And natural enemies are a subclass of insects that we identify as feeding on insect pests. And those can be predators, like this ground beetle here that's feeding on a pupae of a fly in the soil. Those can be parasitoids. The white cocoons here on this caterpillar have emerged from that tomato hornworm, killing it in the process. And there's also pathogens that are considered natural enemies. The viruses, fungi, nematodes that cause disease in insects and killing them in the process. We call these natural enemies because they're in nature and they're enemies of the insects that we don't care for, the pests that feed on our crops. So natural enemy is a general term, and predators is a subclass of that. But the practice that we're studying really can help both parasitoids and predators because they're insects and we're trying to encourage their numbers. So why is that? Well, because we have pests like this. I was hired in 2004 at Iowa State University, in part because of the soybean aphid, this invasive insect that spread throughout the Midwest. And early on, we studied the insecticides that can manage this pest, both foliar applied, through this airplane, but also the seed applied insecticides that are very commonly used now in corn and soybeans. These are the neonicotinoids. And I'm going to talk more about those later this morning. We also explored these natural enemies, specifically predators like the lady beetle that can feed on soybean aphids. And we explored how the landscape around a soybean field determines how many of these lady beetles you're going to find in your field and how much impact they're going to have on soybean aphids. And while we were doing that, back starting in '04, we noticed a lot of these. A lot of pollinators can be found in soybean fields. And to make kind of a long story short, the increase in insecticide use in soybeans as a result of the invasion of the soybean aphid was a source of stress for pollinators like honeybees and other wild bees. And it started my lab thinking about the whole community of beneficial insects that could be in these crop fields and influenced by field adjacent conservation practices. So what's the problem? Well, grassland birds are in decline throughout much of North America. There's some 31 species, 74 of those are in decline, and habitat loss and pesticide exposure are what our colleagues that are ornithologists say are responsible for those declines. Another problem is a decline in monarch populations. This is the overwintering data, the amount of area covered by the monarchs in Mexico, and that area has decreased dramatically over the last decade to the point where some are concerned that it's going to be really hard for that species to maintain itself to a point where we'll even notice it. And the monarch is not the only flower feeding insect that's in decline. North American bees are in decline. There's some 4,000 species that are documented in North America. 8 currently are listed as endangered species. Many others are declining in abundance. And our beekeeper friends note that they see annual losses of some 30%. 30% or more of their hives do not survive from one year to the next. And specifically to endangered species, in the last couple of years, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has listed the rusty patch bumblebee, shown here, as endangered. This is remarkable because it's the first it's the first pollinator bee listed as endangered on the continental United States. The other 7 were all on Hawaii. And this is remarkable for our current audience is Wisconsin, Iowa, parts of Minnesota are part of the range of the rusty patch. The biologists tell us that there's 3 stressors that are responsible for these declines. There's limited floral resources in the landscape. There are parasites and pathogens, viruses, varroa mite for honeybee that are causing harm. And then there's pesticides, not just insecticides, but pyrethroids and neonicotinoids are part of that, but also fungicides that are commonly used in the landscape and can have a synergistic impact on these insects. And this is remarkable because these bees, all of these critters, live in a landscape that's dominated by agriculture. This is USDA data. The green here shows what percentage of a county is committed to ag. For Iowa, that runs on average about 75% corn and soybeans. Not as much in Wisconsin, but still quite a chunk of land is committed to agriculture. And agriculture in this region is very productive. We have some of those productive farms in the world producing a much needed crop of corn and soybeans. But in so doing, it produces a landscape like this where that crop dominates in monocultures where our farmers are very effective in managing weeds. And this produces what the Minnesota Star Tribune called a green desert. Very productive, very green, but a desert for bees that need other resources besides the pollen produced by corn and the nectar produced by soybeans. So is there a solution? Well, we can look back to the history of North America before European settlers arrived to see what a solution could look like. This is prairie, made up not just of grasses, but flowering forbs that could provide resources for native bees. And a group of entomologists at Michigan State University over 2 decades, 2018 or 2008, over a decade now, explored the visitations of wild bees and honeybees to these native plants that would have been found in prairie. And what they found was that many of them are highly attractive. So they produced this chart here where they have some of the most attractive plants that they surveyed and organized them by whether they're attractive to natural enemies or to bees. And the stars represent how many species they found on the plant. The more stars, the more species they found. And they organize all of these based on their bloom period. So wild strawberries bloom in May. The peak is highlighted by the yellow. And when structured this way in the table, you can see that there's a season-long 24/7 buffet of flowers that is available to these pollinators. So then the question is, where can we do this? Where can we practice production agriculture and conservation at the same time? And yeah, here's the punchline: with strips. And the Strips project, the science-based trials of row crops with prairie strips, started at Iowa State. You've probably already heard this now, but I just need to point out that it's a large group of scientists, extension agents, students, and multiple stakeholders exploring how we might be able to add a little bit of prairie back into the landscape to reap multiple benefits. It started with this: the reality that over 7-8 months of the year, our soils are bare and prone to erosion through a scene like this. So it starts with, how do we prevent this water from moving off the landscape with our soils and the nutrients that are there? And it moved through a phase 1 experiment done at the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge, where we demonstrated on small experimental watersheds that a little bit of prairie could act as a barrier to that movement of soil and nutrients. So why prairie? Well, as opposed to our annual crops and even our cover crops, these are perennial. They stay in the landscape, they persist from year to year. They have deep roots that go many feet into the soil, producing soil and making that soil into a sponge to absorb that water and nutrients coming off the land. Above ground, there are stiff stems that stay erect in the pounding rain and can act as a barrier, and they're diverse. It's a diverse community of over 40 species that can help conserve native taxa, especially insects that have co-evolved with these plants. So if we can use prairie as a structural barrier, we might be able to increase our native biodiversity as well. So how good is the solution? Okay, so if you can, turn your microphones up, because I want to demonstrate how good the solution is in some experiments we did in an on-farm commercial setting. So this isn't organic farms. These aren't research farms. These are commercial farms in central Iowa. And this is a demonstration of how good it can be. So what you're hearing is a recording in the summer of the bird community in a farm without a prairie strip. Right? So hopefully you're hearing a little bit of tweeting. Now let's see what a farm would sound like where a prairie strip is established. So hopefully you're able to hear not only more sound, louder sound, but more diverse sounds. And in the background of all those birds tweeting, there's some buzzing of insects. In terms of birds, the graduate student, Jordan Geese, I kid you not, that is his last name. Jordan Geese, working with Lisa Schulte-Moore and others, have shown that in farms with the prairie strips, they see more birds on a per area basis. And these are birds that are of great conservation need, that are in decline, but they're responding positively to the presence of the prairie strips. And they document this both with visual observation, but with those sound recordings as well. Now, how good is this for insects? And again, this is the same setting, but now we're going to send out a team to explore several different things. Caroline Murray recent master's student, is going to look at the flowering plant community at these prairie strips. Maura Hall is a toxicologist, and she's going to track the occurrence of pesticides in those fields. And Ge Zhang, a PhD student recently completed, is going to explore the response of honeybees to farms with and without the prairie strips. And this group makes up our insect response field team to see how well the insect community, beneficial insect community, is responding to these prairie strips. So it starts with Caroline. She went to multiple sites in central Iowa to see how good these were for pollinators. She starts with strip sites that have this high diversity seed mix, where the strips are placed along field contours or stream edges. And she compares what she sees there with what we call control sites, where a prairie strip isn't established, but there is some non-crop habitat like a field edge that you see here, or a grass waterway. And these haven't been managed for pollinators, and they haven't been disturbed and planted with prairie seeds like the strip sites have. So one of the first things she sees is the data presented here. The y-axis is the mean number of blooming flowers she finds when she goes out on a monthly or twice a month visit. You're going to see multiple slides like this. The green represent the control sites, where we had the field edges by the roadside or a grass waterway. The yellow represents the prairie strips. And numerically throughout the year, she sees more blooming flowers in the prairie strips than the control sites. And this becomes really noticeable when we get into September, when the late flowering plants in those prairie strips come on, and we see orders of magnitude more flowers than in the control strips, where we basically don't see any. And why is that? Well, there are more flowering plant species. So this is the number of species of plants that we see blooming in those strips. Again, green is control, yellow is strips. Numerically about the same in early June, but as the season goes on, there's over 5-6 species blooming at any one time in the prairie strips, and maybe one, if any, in the controls. What's interesting and a little bit counterintuitive maybe is how many milkweed plants are in those sites. So this is the stems of milkweed that she found in those. Even though I told you that there were more flowers and more flowering plant species in the strip sites, there were more stems of milkweed in the control than the strip sites. And maybe this is a bit counterintuitive because, we have more diversity, more flowers, but milkweed is just that. It's a weed, and it can outcompete a few species, especially grasses, or maybe not outcompete, but it can do well in those situations, like you see here. But in a mix of 40 plants, like we would have in a prairie strip, it doesn't do as well. It's there, and it's part of the seed mix, but it's not as abundant as it would be in a control site. So maybe a little bit counterintuitive. But to finish the story, she sees more adult monarchs at farms with strips than at the control sites. So the y-axis here is the number of adult monarchs that she observes when she walks a transect along those sites for about 100 meters. And numerically, throughout the 3 months that she explores these strips and the control sites, there are more monarchs, more adults, than at the strip sites than at the control. And this is most notable in August, which is kind of remarkable because even though there are more milkweed in the control, there's more flowering resources here. And this is a remarkable time in the life cycle of the monarchs, because this is when the adults are feeding, getting ready to take that trip back to Mexico. There are also several native pollinators in these prairie strips beyond the monarch butterfly. I think we're up to maybe 100 species that we've identified. This is just a subset of those. They include some ground nesting bees like Melissoides bimaculata, lasioglossums, Some of these are remarkably beautiful, like the Agapostivans, phorescens, this metallic bee, but they're not all bees. They're also flies, like this flower fly, Surfeid, Toxomerus marginatus. This is a really remarkable insect. As an adult, it feeds on flowers, but the larval stage, which is often found in soybean fields, feeds on other insects. It's a predator in the larval stage of insects like the soybean aphid. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. But all of these are found in the prairie strips, and their abundance is greater in strips than in the adjacent crop field. And this is work that's been published by some of our colleagues in a paper in PLOS ONE, open access journal. You can find it here at this link. Craig, if people can't write this down, I'm sure you can share this with them later. But this opens up a question. And the question is, are these exposed to neonicotinoids? Some, depending upon where you are in the United States, 100% of corn is, or 90% of corn is grown with a neonicotinoid seed treatment. 40 to 60% of soybeans are. And we know that these products don't stay on the seed and in the plant, but they move into the soil and can move downhill into watersheds. We recently, as of this month, published a paper quantifying neonicotinoid insecticide residues in milkweed and other forbs sampled from prairie strips established in maize and soybean fields. This is a work of the graduate student, Maura Hall, and Ge Zhang, along with several of us at Iowa State, including Steve Bradbury and Joel Coates, two toxicologists who specialize in detecting pesticides in our environment. This, again, is available in an open access journal if you want to read more details about this. I'm just going to highlight a couple of findings from this and some other work that Maura has in her dissertation. So what did we do? Well, we went to sites like this where we had prairie strips, and we went along the upward slope and collected soil right at the edge of the prairie strip to see if any of the neonics were moving off the soil into this habitat. We also pulled leaf and stem tissue from flowering plants throughout the season to see if these systemic insecticides are being taken up from the soil and into the plants, especially looking at milkweed, because that's the host plant that the monarch larvae need in order to complete their life cycle. And this is what we found, or what Maura found, because she's the toxicologist doing the chemical analysis here. And what you see here on the y-axis is the concentration in nanograms per gram, or parts per billion, for 3 commonly used neonicotinoids: clothianidin, thiamethoxam, and imidacloprid. These are mostly used on seed, although there are some formulations of foliar insecticides in which things like imidacloprid can be applied to foliage. And what she found for the soil is, every time we went out into the field and brought back soil, we could see evidence of neonicotinoids in the soil at the edge of that prairie strip. When it came to plants, and this is milkweed and other plants, again, the concentration in nanograms per gram or parts per billion here on the y-axis. Again, we could find evidence of neonics in those plant tissues. But I want to point out a couple of things here. Note the scale. We went from 0 to 10 parts per billion with soil, and now we're going from like 0 to 3, with the averages being below 1 part per billion. So what we're seeing is, those insecticide, those neonics are there, but they're and they're present in the soil 100% of the time, but their concentration diminishes as we go from soil to plants. Now, monarchs feed on leaves, but bees and other pollinators feed on nectar and pollen. So we wanted to see if this trend continues into that business end of the plant. So how do we do that? Well, Maura and her crew go out with this modified vacuum cleaner to vacuum off bees that are visiting the flowers. We call this bee fishing. She would go out and fish for bees while they're actively visiting these flowers. And then she brought them back to the lab and took off the pollen that is on these pollen baskets, the little modified part of the leg. And process those to see if there's neonics in the pollen baskets. She also dissected the bees and removed the honey stomach, which is where they store the nectar that they collect before taking it back to their hive to feed to their brood, their young. And both of these she took to the lab to process for neonicotinoid detection. So there's a lot of data in this entire analysis, but I wanted to summarize it in this table here to show a trend that I think is really interesting. This is the location where we're looking for neonics: the soil, the plant tissue, I just mentioned that earlier, the nectar and the pollen. And then this is the percent of time that the samples registered a detection using our chemical analysis. So 100% of the soil that we brought back, we detected neonics. 80% of the plant tissue, but only 15% of the nectar that we found in the bees, and only 2% or 2.5% of the pollen that we found on the bees had neonics. So you see this decline in occurrence as you go from soil to the part of the plant that the bees are visiting and using. And then the next question is, well, what about in the colony, especially for honeybees? Those bees are foraging in those fields, in those prairie strips, and then bringing that back to the colony. How much of those end up in the bees that are in the colony? And to answer this question, our beekeeping PhD student, Ge Zhang, would pull bees from the hive. And what you see here is a frame of comb, of honeybee comb, where the bees are raising their young, their brood. And the bees that are on this comb are what we call nurse bees. These are the bees that take care of the larvae, feeding them food so that they can complete their life cycle and become adult worker bees. And so Ge would go into each of the hives at multiple times of the year and pull out a subsample of these bees that are nursing, feeding the larvae. And then give those to Maura to look to see if there's any evidence that neonicotinoids are on in those bees. And what she found was that less than 1% of the bees, these nurse worker bees, had evidence of neonicotinoids. And I'm noticing a question here from Alyssa Salamore. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Do you think the concentrations of neonicotinoids in the soil impact ground nesting pollinators, or is contaminated pollen nectar the more important avenue of exposure? Very good question. We did not explicitly explore the impact on soil nesting bees. It's really hard to track those. Their occurrence in the soil is somewhat random and they're hard to follow. Most of what we're doing is just accounting for their abundance and diversity. There's a lot of work left to be done to see if this potential soil exposure is a detriment to them. Having said that, we still see soil nesting bees in prairie strips, even though these products are being used in the adjacent cropland. When it comes to the concentrations, let me just summarize some of Maura's published work and soon we hope to be published work. Neonics are found in all of these places: prairie strips, soils, flowering plants, pollen, and nectar. The frequency of detections, though, decline as you go from soil to nectar to honeybees. And the concentrations, especially in the soil and the plant, and as we get into the nectar and pollen, are orders of magnitude below the LC50 for monarchs, as well as for honeybees. What is the LC50? That's a lethal concentration that would kill 50% of the population. Now, that has been determined in laboratory assays, and the concentrations we're seeing in the plants are orders of magnitude, like 10-fold to 100-fold less than that. And the other thing I should say is, well, maybe the proof is in the pudding. We observed no honeybee colony deaths in the 3 years of the study in which we were putting bees out into these prairie strips. And let me talk a little bit about that, because that's the work of Ge Zhang. So we kept honeybees at those control sites that Caroline Murray walked in looking for, how many flowers were there, and tracking monarchs and other pollinators. And we also put these honeybee hives and prairie strips. And he started this in 2017 with limited resources. We only had enough for 2 hives. But in 2018 and 19, thanks to funding from the FFAR program, we could increase that to 4. And we did this over 5 paired sites, 5 control sites and 5 prairie strip sites. And GA tracked the growth of the colonies from a standard size over the course of the growing season. And here you see him and his crew assessing how many adult bees are on a frame. And this is a way of assessing the adult bee population, which gives us some idea of how the colony is doing, how its population is growing. And he also measured the weight of the colony. So if you subtract the weight of the wood and the frames, you can get a sense of how much weight the colony is gaining as it goes out into the surrounding landscape and forages for resources like pollen and nectar. And by the end of the summer, most of the weight in a colony is the honey that they've converted from the nectar they've foraged on in the surrounding landscape. I just noticed a question. Yeah, I'll try to talk more about the impact of fungicides and insecticides later. What I'd like to do right now is share with you GA's results on how these honeybees are responding to these different locations. So what you see here is the estimate of the adult honeybee population. And this is in what we call frame size of bees. That's how many frames have adult bees on them. And it's a way of estimating the adult population. And then GA went out pretty much every 2 weeks throughout the field season from June until early October, tracking this by opening up the hives and looking in each one of them, kept at the 2 different sites, the control sites, where we just had the field edges of, along a roadside or a grass waterway, or the strip sites. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is right here, that we start in June and the number of adult bees is the same. So GA takes these hives out in mid-June. And before he does, he makes sure that they're all the same size in terms of the amount of adult bees and how much honey they have and how many stacks of boxes. So they're all the same so that we can track their growth over time. And what you see is pretty clear here that almost immediately, from June to July, there's more adult bees in the hives with kept at prairie strips than at the control sites. This isn't always statistically significant. That's what these asterisks represent. They represent where statistical significance occurs. That shows up in the first 2 weeks and then at the end of the season. And this is remarkable because at the end of the season, we're now taking those colonies and returning them to our overwintering site to track their survival as they go from one field season to the next. So what you see here is an average of over 3 years worth of data. And consistently, we see that the prairie strips maintain a higher population of adult honeybees. Now, beekeepers benefit by having more bees, especially commercial scale beekeepers who will then rent their hives that they have kept in, say, the Midwest to fruit and vegetable growers in the East and West Coast. And the more bees they have in their colonies, the higher premium they're going to get when they go to write contracts for, say, an almond farm. So this can be a very good thing. But beekeepers, especially in this period, are looking for their bees to produce honey. So we estimated honey production by the amount of weight the colonies gained. So GA would take a scale out. He knows the weight of the woodwork, subtracts that from what he measures at each time period. And again, I draw your attention to the first point here. The colonies all weighed the same at the start. And early on, that weight difference isn't There is no weight difference really, even though there's more adult bees here. That isn't enough to account for a significant difference in weight. But over time, as we go through the growing season, we see separation, a remarkable separation, and statistically significant. So those colonies kept at strip sites gained more weight, and that weight, especially in August, is honey, to the tune of about a 24% increase in productivity. And there's 24% more honey in the hives kept at the strip sites than the control sites. And we did not harvest the honey. All right, we're doing an experiment, so we want to see how the bees sort of behave over time. And we didn't want to add an additional disturbance of honey harvest. So we allowed the bees to keep their honey as they go into October. And we see this decline. And this is kind of interesting because what this shows is from the peak here in August to October, the bees are consuming what they stored. Right? And we've seen this in multiple experiments, and beekeepers know about this. Even after they harvest their honey, they have to supplementally feed in this period to make sure the bees have something to feed on, survive on through the winter. But they're maintaining that difference by being in the prairie strip. So what does this mean? Well, you get more honey with prairie strips. And I showed you the numeric way, kind of the eggheady academic way in the figure. This is what it looks like in the field. These are beehives at a control site in August. Note that each one of these towers represent a single colony, and these colonies have 3 boxes. The top 2 boxes are where the bees are storing their honey. At the beehives kept at a prairie strip, we had to add an additional box because they were bringing in so much nectar, they ran out of storage space. This is that 24% increase that I was pointing out in the previous figure. This is what it looks like in the field. Now, I'm kind of getting to the end, so I want to talk about some other things that we've learned. So prairies conserve more than bees. Our colleague, Matt Liebman, Mary Harris, and Farnaras Kornbach have shown that there's a robust community of these critters. These are ground beetles that I talked about at the beginning. These are classified as natural enemies. They feed on insects that overwinter, reside in the soil, but they also feed on seeds, and they're known to be voracious predators of the weed seeds. These are found in prairie strips, and there's evidence that they're moving from those prairie strips into the crop fields. And that's a good thing. We also saw more surfeids when Caroline was doing her sampling in fields with prairie strips. And this is a good thing because these, as I mentioned earlier, in their larval stage are predators. They're voracious predators of soft-bodied insects like aphids. So this maggot is the immature stage of the surfeid, and the fly, the adult fly, lays its eggs on soybeans. Those eggs hatch, and then these maggots crawl around feeding on the aphid by dropping in its mandibles and sucking out the blood of the aphid. A very satisfying way to watch an aphid die. And then they hatch, or they go into adult stage, and they fly back into the prairie strips looking for nectar from the flower resources that are there. So to kind of wrap this up, what do you get from prairie strips? Well, when we compare, control sites like this to a farm with prairie strip, you see an increase in bird abundance. You see an increase on the number of flowers and flowering plant diversity. And that's a good thing because just having one flowering species isn't enough. You need to, if you want to actively conserve beneficial insects, you need to provide them a resource that can provide food throughout the growing season. And one plant won't do that. You need multiple plants in order to have the flowering throughout the summer. We saw an increased abundance of pollinators when we compare what we see in the prairie strip to the adjacent crop. We saw increased honeybee productivity. And I know not everybody's a beekeeper on this call. I think we had about 12% of you note that you're a beekeeper as a hobby. There were a few of you who are keeping at a commercial scale. But I think all of you should find this interesting. I hope all of you find this interesting because honeybees, one, they're a form of agriculture, beekeeping, but they're also, I think, a way to get some insight into how bees are responding to something like the prairie strip practice. We can't go into bumblebee hives. We can't go in and find all this ground nesting bees. It's really difficult, and we don't know all of their biology and ecology to the degree that we know honeybee biology and ecology. And so honeybees, I think, give us some insight into how other bees might be responding to this practice. And if they are responding in any way like the honeybees, we should see higher populations and higher productivity in terms of them being able to use the resources to feed their young. We also see an increase in the abundance of key natural enemies, ones that we know provide some biological control to insect pests that can be found in the adjacent crop, like soybean aphids and weed seeds. And all of this is occurring on commercial farms where the farmers are using conventional herbicides and insecticides, including neonicotinoid seed treatments. Now, that's not to say that the pesticides aren't having a negative impact. They might, most likely are, but I think the take-home story here is, despite that, we're still seeing all of these other increases. And I think that's a sign of just how in need our beneficial insect community is for the resources that prairie strips can provide us. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop right there, if that's okay, Craig. Or how are we doing on time?
We're good on time. It's 8:45. We've got three very good questions in the Q&A. Matt, maybe you just want to read them yourself.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing, if that's okay, and let's go to the Q&A. Okay, so Connie Crancer asked early on, are strips a sink or source for pollinators? So that was early in the talk. I think the evidence that we have to date is that they can be a source for pollinators. The concern with the pesticide use in the adjacent crop is that it can move on to the prairie strip either through drift or in foliar application or in the movement of the neonics in the soil and subsurface water, and we clearly see evidence for that. I don't want to sugarcoat that, but what we're seeing in terms of the detection and the concentrations is it's below levels that would cause a lethal impact. And when we actively keep honeybees in these farms with prairie strips, we're not seeing evidence of a lethal impact. If anything, we're seeing evidence of them responding very positively, increasing their population and their honey production. So I cannot disprove a negative, or I can't prove a negative. I can't say that they're not sinks, because again, there's some 60 to 100 bee species out there. Many of them are soil nesting, and they're likely experiencing exposures to insecticides that I can't account for. But in terms of the ones that we are tracking, we don't see evidence of a sink. If anything, we see evidence of a source. So hopefully that answers your question, Connie. Edward, I'd like to know the effect of fungicides on honeybee larvae, more so the insecticides. The feed to young bees is affected by fermentation of the pollen. Yeah, so this is a really cutting edge part of research in the honeybeeology world. There's evidence that fungicides that are used in corn and soybeans can be found in the honeybee colony. They're making their way into the field, most likely through contaminated pollen and nectar. And fungicides, they kill fungus, and you can say, well, how could that hurt a bee? Well, there's some evidence that there are fungi in the honeybee gut that is used to help them break down the foods that they bring in and make it more nutritious for their larvae. To what extent this is having an impact on honeybees is still being explored, but it's something that our colleagues are showing us can have an impact on honeybee survival. I can't say much more about it than that. And then Jeff Williams asks, what about neonicotinoids traveling into marshes via prairie strips and killing the macroinverts needed by waterfowl during spring migration? North Dakota Game and Fish is seeing massive die-offs of farm wetlands via neonic contamination. I'm not familiar with the data coming out of North Dakota, but I can say that we have seen evidence of neonics in watersheds, wetlands, and it's very clear that it's coming from the use of these products in the adjacent cropland. One thing that we've seen, I didn't talk about this, was in our first phase of studying prairie strips, we looked at the occurrence of neonics in prairie strips. And what we found was that they do accumulate even after the products are used. But it looks as if they are filtering that out as the water moves from the prairie strip into the watershed. So I guess it depends upon your perspective, but as I pointed out, we do see the neonics in the soil of the prairie strip. What that suggests to me is that those prairie strips can capture that. And hopefully, I don't have evidence from the commercial farms, but hopefully it's stopping that from moving off of the farm into the larger watersheds. That's a question maybe for future research. Scrolling down here, Tim Smith asked, natural enemies need a food source. Do strips harbor an absolute increase in undesired species? Oh, very good question. So I've told you kind of a subset of the data that we have. We have looked in prairie strips to see if any of the insect pests that we would worry about in our adjacent crop. We don't see an increase in insect pests in the prairie strips. To date, we haven't seen any evidence that the prairie strips are harboring those pests and then they're moving into the adjacent cropland, mostly because the major pests of corn and soybean in our region, soybean aphid, corn rootworm, don't reside in those prairie strips. So, so no evidence that those pests are moving from the prairie strips into the adjacent cropland. But there are a wide variety of herbivores in prairie strips, and those seem to be native species that have co-evolved with those plants. And yeah, the natural enemies that we were talking about likely feed on those. Anonymous attendee asked, many of the photos displayed in your presentation show crops right up against the prairie strips. Were there buffers for the pesticide application near the strips, or were pesticides applied edge to edge right against the strips? Oh, great question. Yeah, so to date, in our exploration of prairie strips and commercial farms, we are not asking the farmers to adjust their farming practices. They're not adding a buffer of untreated corn or soybean next to the prairie strip. So yeah, they're farming right up alongside that. To what extent the occurrence of neonicotinoids would vary, would be less if that kind of buffer was added, I don't know, but it's been one that some of my colleagues have proposed as a way to get even more benefit and reduce the exposure. That's up to the farmer to do. Right now, there's no obligation in terms of the CP practice that a farmer has to put in such a buffer. Mark Valling asks, how does a person get a hold of or afford the seed to plant a prairie strip? Craig, I think that was the topic of some of the previous sessions with Tim Youngquist. Maybe it's some.
Yes. Yeah. And for those of you who weren't on the first or second session, we'll post PDFs of those and the recordings and email you tomorrow with a link to all that. But we have 2 hours of great information on siting strips, establishing strips. There's information about accessing seed sources. But to put it quickly, There's a lot of either private companies or organizations offering seed mixes. Pheasants Forever has seed mixes. Some of those are specific to the CRP Prairie Strip practice, which is brand new, CP43. So there are many options out there, and we'll send you some of that information.
Yeah, and maybe a topic in the future, invite our colleague John Tyndall, who's a economist, who's done some back of the envelope calculations to see how cost effective Prairie Strips is as a soil erosion mitigation practice compared to other practices that a farmer could do, like cover crops, bioreactors, et cetera. And it's his story to tell, but from what I understand, Prairie Strips, yeah, it will cost you money. Right? It has to, because you're taking land out of production. But thanks to CRP and the CP43 practice, it becomes very cost effective. I think it costs like $8 an acre when you account for the opportunity costs, the lost productivity, but also the cost of buying the seed and managing the establishment. How are we doing on time, Craig? I'm noticing there's a lot of.
No, we're good. I think we could go we go 3 or 4 minutes until we wrap up. And Tim, I'm going to, Matt, I'm sorry, I'm going to put your email on the next slide so people can contact you directly. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Questions?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll try to get to.
Also, I'm going to throw up a slide on the CRP, the CP43 practice. We don't need to talk about how it works, but there's a few bullet points folks can reference about what's available through that cost share program.
Bob Recker asks, I'm looking at ever wider cover crop spaces between corn rows, such as 80-inch corn to a corn plant. Do you think it's feasible to establish Prairie Strips as a permanent fixture in my cornfields? There may be rotation. Rotation between corn and cover crops sandwiched in between the Prairie Strips. I'm going to say that sounds like a very specific question that I'm not quite sure I understand the configuration there. Bob, maybe send me an email. Maybe you and I can have a side conversation.
Matt, I'll jump in too. I'll say
like
60-inch corn. Can you fit prairie in those very narrow strips? I mean, I'll just speak on behalf of some of your colleagues on the weed management and so forth, where I hear like it's the edge that's really hard to manage. Weeds inevitably, occupy that edge between crop and Prairie Strip. And right here on the CRP, you see 30-foot minimum width for getting the eligibility for CRP payments. And I hear that a lot, like 30-foot minimum, maybe wider for, from there, just because it's not worth messing with those narrow edges, trying to manage vegetation between the crop and then the established native prairie.
Yeah. Thank you. What pesticide risk mitigation practices should be used by farmers who have Prairie Strips? That's a great question. And I think that's one where we could have a long discussion about, what you should do versus what you can do versus maybe what you need to do. And one thing I might note is that Prairie Strips as a practice were developed to address soil erosion and runoff, the loss of nitrogen and phosphorus from crop fields into watersheds. And that's what I call the hamburger. That's the meat of the hamburger for Prairie Strips as a practice. And to date, we see no evidence that farmers have to adjust their pesticide use in the adjacent crop to get those Prairie Strips established and to see that benefit. When we talk about conserving biodiversity, whether it's the plants, the birds, or the insects, I jokingly refer to that as the sesame seeds on the bun of the Prairie Strip hamburger. It's a bonus, and it wasn't something that we intentionally set out to manage for, but it's something that we have been pleasantly surprised at. And again, we haven't asked farmers when they're putting this practice into place to change their pest management practices. So Laura, to your question, what should be used? Well, to date, I don't need to tell, I'm not going to tell farmers they have to do anything. But if they want to maybe build upon what they're getting from the prairie strips, there are a lot of things they could do when it comes to pest management that could limit the exposure of the beneficial insects in those prairie strips. One of them could be, when possible, switch your pest management practices from insecticides to something else. All right, so for soybean aphids, consider using, if it's available to you, an aphid-resistant variety of soybeans. Next one, for both corn and soybeans, consider adopting some integrated pest management tactics, like instead of using insecticides on a calendar basis in a prophylactic manner, use them when the pests are there and are above thresholds indicating that they're going to cause yield loss. Many of our farmers that we've worked with in Iowa, especially through the Practical Farmers of Iowa, have indicated that, when they started putting in check strips to see if their seed treatments were actually providing them a benefit, they found that it wasn't always providing them an improvement in yield. And that is sort of the first step towards thinking about pest management more holistically, where you're not just using the product preventatively, prophylactically, you're thinking about it more as an active tactic where you're going to use it when it's needed, where it's needed. And that can go a long way in reducing the potential exposure of beneficial insects to pesticides, especially insecticides. So anonymous attendee asked, any thoughts about the impact of pesticide drift from the crop fields into the strips? Not quite. So we do see evidence of pesticide drift. One subset of data from Maura's work is we detected lambda-cyhalothrin and chlorpyrifos in the pollen of honeybees kept in a prairie strip. And that's likely coming from drift or just the use of those pesticides in the adjacent cropland. But again, the concentrations were, fairly low. And we, in terms of the survival of honeybees that we kept in the prairie strips, we didn't lose hives because of that. One way to limit that type of exposure is the use of bee registries. So the state of Iowa participates in the Drift Watch program. This is an online program where beekeepers can note the location of their hives, and then pesticide applicators have to adjust the spraying of their pesticides within a mile radius of those hives to limit exposure. And that adjustment involves spraying when it's at dusk. So bees forage in daylight, and their foraging stops as daylight goes away. So spraying it late in the afternoon, early evening can limit the exposure to bees. I don't know if Wisconsin participates in Drift Watch, but that type of communication can go a long way in preventing drift from being an issue, at least for honeybees. Julie asks, have you seen suppression management of soybean aphids in fields with prairie strips due to increased natural enemy activity? How much land needs to be in strips to impact abundance of pests such as soybean aphids? Yeah, so the soybean aphids we looked at specifically early on in this strips project. And unfortunately, we didn't see any evidence that the presence of the prairie strip was in reducing soybean aphid populations, in part because the natural enemies that were in greater abundance in the soybean fields were not those that would attack the soybean aphid. So one thing I should point out when it comes to the ecology of the soybean aphid is it's a invasive pest. It's not native to North America. And if you think more deeply, neither is the soybean plant. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the native plants and native natural enemy community found in prairie strips with these exotic introduced species that are right next door. What we find is that the soybean aphid is preyed upon by lady beetles and attacked by some parasitoids, but these, the ones that do the most damage are not native to North America. So the multicolored Asian lady beetle, the one that gets in your homes in the fall, that's a voracious predator of soybean aphids, but it's not native, and it doesn't really respond well at all to to prairie strips, which in some ways is a good thing, because many people note that that lady beetle is a bit of a pest as well. It gets into our homes, can be kind of a nuisance pest, especially in the fall when it's gathering to overwinter. So for the management of invasive pests, I don't think prairie strips are going to provide much benefit. The next question you ask about, well, how about the spillover effect, especially for things like ground beetles and the consumption of weed seeds that comes with their presence? That's an area of ongoing study. That's an experiment we're starting this year. And we've got a new graduate student, Andres Vargas, that is working with Lisa Schulte and I to answer what that spillover effect might be like for weed seed predation. So stay tuned, more to come on that area. Paul Overby, have you looked at any benefits to the crops adjacent to strips, thinking of soybeans next to strips since they flower to set seed? Oh my gosh, Paul, man, you guys are crushing it on asking the real cutting edge stuff. This is a fascinating area of research. So corn is self-pollinated, it's wind pollinated, it's wind pollinated. Bees don't matter when it comes to pollinating corn. Soybeans produce flowers that have nectar and pollen, and it has been bred for self-pollination, but there is this amazing growing body of literature by entomologists and agronomists, especially in Brazil, looking at how the soybean plant responds to the presence of honeybees. And what we're seeing from their experiments over the last 5 to 10 years is, if you can increase the visitation of soybean flowers from things like honeybees, but also wild bees, there's evidence that you can increase soybean yield. And I think, Paul, you're connecting the dots and saying, well, if prairie strips are there and they're increasing pollinator abundance, might that increase pollination of soybean flowers, and could we see an increase in yield? I'm curious about that as well. It's really hard to study because you've got to compare it to soybean in the same field that are not being visited by pollinators. So you got to find some way to prevent that. And it's tricky to do that in a way that doesn't also affect yield. Craig, I can share with you some links to some studies that have attempted to do this in Brazil, and you can share it with your audience. But to make a long story short, there could be some benefit, but we haven't yet measured it. And one of the things to keep in mind is it might require honey beekeeping in order to see that benefit. Honeybees, especially in the Midwest, get a lot of their nectar crop from soybeans. A lot of the beekeepers talk about how soybeans, honey is a soy-based product because most of the nectar is coming from soybeans. And in the South, especially in Mississippi, beekeepers actively look for soybean fields to keep their hives in order to make a honey crop. And there might be in the future recommendations on stocking rates to get the yield enhancement from honeybees in terms of pollinating soy crops. But we don't have the data to draw from yet to make those recommendations. Sorry to go off on a bit of a tangent there, Paul, but that's a fascinating question. And I think it's one that is going to be a topic of research in the next couple of years. Anand says, ask, ground pollinators and strip exposure to leach pesticides and strip. This is a concern. We have evidence that can happen. What we don't have evidence on is what is the risk. The concentrations are fairly low compared to the LC50s for things like monarchs and honeybees, but each species is different. And there is some evidence out of Nigel Rain's lab at University of Guelph that ground nesting bumblebees suffer a reduction in fertility when they're exposed to neonics. So yeah, it's an area of concern. To what extent the benefits of the prairie strip and all the forage and food are canceled by that pesticide exposure, I don't know, but it's an active area of research. Thelma Heidelbaker. Hey, Thelma. She spent some time with us down in Iowa State. I hope you're doing well. What are the distances into cropland that you're seeing the beneficial impacts of the predators next to the strips? Well, like I said earlier, we're not seeing that for soybean aphids, but some initial work with carabids suggests that they're moving as far as 60 meters. So what is that in terms of feet? 180 feet. So there's evidence for a spillover effect. They're clearly leaving the prairie strip going into the adjacent crop. But as far as the impact goes, that's the next level. That's the next step for us, and we haven't measured that yet. Hope you're doing well, Thelma. Tom Smith, sorry. Did any of your current strip research take place near a farm that was not using neonics and fungicides? Unfortunately, no. There were a couple of fields that we investigated where in a given year they didn't use neonics, but unfortunately we still saw evidence of neonics in the adjacent cropland. And that's a function of the neonics persisting in the soil for several months past their usage, up to a year. And also neonics are, they find their way into the dust that's produced at planting, and that can blow around and land on a prairie strip. So even if the immediate adjacent field isn't using neonics, there's some concern that surrounding fields might be contaminating them as well. And anonymous attendee, if I may, your research seems to show that insecticides and or fungicides are not deleterious to honeybees, increased honey production. I think anyone in ag must be careful about the hypotheses we draw about these products, or they may be banned and agriculture may be severely impacted from their loss. Not really a question there. I would say this, I can't say in our experiment that honeybees were not affected by neonics or pesticide exposure, that there were other pesticides being used there. But in balance, I didn't see evidence that the exposure to the exposure to pesticides was greater when bees were kept at a site with prairie strips than without. And in net terms, the bees seem to do well, better, I should say, at a prairie strip than a site without a prairie strip. I think the big question going forward, and I know the vast majority of you are not beekeepers, but for our big beaks, our big beekeepers, I think they're going to ask questions about, well, just how good is a prairie strip compared to the sites that they keep their bees at in Wisconsin, Iowa, et cetera. And yeah, that's the next question is it worthwhile commercially keeping bees at a farm with prairie strips? And Katie Savinelli says, thank you, Matt. Great presentation. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I think this is the last one. Have honeybee populations in Europe recovered since many EU countries have banned neonics? I don't think we can say that the EU has totally banned neonics. They have restricted their use, especially on flowering plants, flowering crops that are visited by bees. But I don't think it's an outright ban. But to the main point of your question, I don't know the status of honeybees in Europe. I don't know if there's been a marketable increase since that restriction in use. I apologize, I can't answer that. But it's a very interesting question. Craig, Tricia,
Yes,
did we do it? Are we done?
we did it. Thanks so much, Matt. That was excellent. We had about half the audience stay on for the extra Q&A. I'm sorry, I'm typing in my email
People
address.
actually listen to all of that? Oh my God.
Yes. Here's my email address in the chat. And we'll follow up with an email with more information. But hey, get a hold of us if any of you, especially in Wisconsin or Illinois or this near upper Midwest area, want to partner with us and Iowa State and others on field events, profiles, videos, anyway, further investigations of prairie strips. And Matt, you got something else to say?
Yeah, I forgot. Shameless self-promotion. At the ISU Hort Farm and at our bookstore, if your audience is still on, if there's still anybody listening, after this year, we started selling prairie strip honey. From our colonies that we kept at a commercial field, we saw a greater production in soybean greater production of honey, and we harvested it just from that site. It's a distinctive honey. I can tell you from some non-scientific taste tests that people have noticed a difference in it versus the regular honey we produce at our Hort Farm. And you can buy it and support Prairie Strips through that value-added product. All right, shameless plug over. So, thanks, Craig. Thanks for that.
All right, thanks everybody. We appreciate it. And if those of you who didn't see the QR code and you submitted your numbers in the chat, we're getting all those, or if you emailed them to Tricia, we got those too, and we'll submit those on your behalf. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Matt, again.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Yep, see you later.